romance, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 13. We Can None of Us Help Our Nature. Hello, husband.
Hello, English schoolgirl.
I play a little. No. Thank you for that. And so, this is a great chapter, isn't it? We get a big introduction to... You say that like it's a bad thing. Big introduction to Mr. Rochester.
Yeah, it's a very chatty chapter.
Mm-hmm. It's establishing a lot of character and relationship dynamics.
That's one way of putting it, yeah. We get to see kind of what a stubborn man he is, and yet still alluring to the opposite sex.
This is true.
Yes.
All right, let's just dig right into Chapter 13, Spark Notes Summary. The day following his arrival, Mr. Rochester invites Jane and Adele to have tea with him. He is abrupt and rather cold toward both of them, although he seems charmed by Jane's drawings, which he asks to see. When Jane mentions to Mrs. Fairfax that she finds Rochester changeful and abrupt, Mrs. Fairfax suggests that his mannerisms are the result of a difficult personal history. Rochester was something of a family outcast, and when his father died, his older brother inherited Thornfield. Rochester has been Thornfield's proprietor for 9 years, since the death of his brother.
Spark Notes is kind of really succinct for this chapter. It's weird. Like, half of that summary is from, like, the last paragraph of the chapter.
That's the main import of this chapter, is Mr. Rochester's younger, whatever happened in his youth.
4, 5, 6 pages of conversation, and Spark Notes is just like, I saw some drawings, and he's charmed, although I'm not sure if I would say charmed by the drawings. He seemed like he was a little judgmental. I don't know.
Oh, okay. I guess, this, obviously, I've read this book often, and it's been many years since that first time for me. So, that, now that this is your second reading, I'd be curious to know more. What do you think of Mr. Rochester and Jane? Like, do you think that this is the beginning of a great romance, or this is just a weird sort of...
Not what I expected, I think, I mean, I'm trying to think of how I thought 5 years ago when I read it for the first time, and now I know, now I'm starting to look. Before, it was sort of like, I don't know what she sees in him, or... and then I know how their relationship is going to progress. And so then I'm rereading it and I'm like, oh, okay, I could see where there was little touches where she might be charmed.
Okay. Okay.
And I think we may have talked about it on the last episode. Sometimes, from a pickup artist standpoint, the idea of a neg, like if you want to say something negative and somehow women seem to like that, like it's really weird where if the man, as we're going to see in this chapter, he's very aloof.
Yeah.
And yet that just makes him seem just so much more mysterious to her.
I see.
Which is, I mean, it's bizarre. Again, you're dealing with two characters that are well known throughout literary history. It's not quite the introduction that I was expecting.
Right. Yeah.
And then not only the introduction with falling off the horse and stuff. That's actually I think that's a great scene.
I think so too. Yeah.
But then this first conversation is just like, come down to have dinner. And then I'm barely going to acknowledge you. And then when I do acknowledge you, I'm just going to be kind of an ass,
Yeah, but when he does acknowledge her, like, he's just focused on her. He doesn't want to talk to Adele. He doesn't want to talk to Miss Fairfax. Like, he is only interested in what Jane has to say. And I think that can be alluring, maybe, for Jane.
No. I mean, she's the newbie, right?
Yeah.
I think maybe he's he's definitely tired of Adele. And as we'll learn...
Immediately tired of her.
Yeah, well, we're going to learn all the history of his relationship with Adele later, and you're like, okay, I can see why he may be a little tired of her. And then, Mrs. Fairfax is just, okay, that's the lady running the house.
Yeah.
And she's always there, and so he's probably already had all of his conversations with her. And you said there's a somewhat of a distant relation,
right?
As well, so he probably already knows her. And is he going to take the time to get to know any of the wait staff, the other staff there?
I don't. Obviously, it's hard to tell now from, our modern times whether or not in Victorian times how odd would this be for the master of the house to be speaking this way to the governess? Is she that much lower social class that maybe it's more likely that he just wouldn't talk to her at all, or wouldn't be interested? Mm-hmm. I mean, he doesn't have a wife to kind of deal with all that. I would assume the wife would deal with all the governesses and caretaking of the children, whereas the man would just go off and do whatever men do at that time.
Oh, well, yeah. And Jane does have kind of an intriguing backstory as well. Like, you don't think about it. You got an orphan. You know, when she talks about Lowood, he seems to know what that is.
Yeah.
You know, considering that it's not like it's in the neighborhood, and doesn't he drop Brocklehurst's name as well too? Like he
seems to know about the school and what went on there, at least at a certain point.
I wonder, does he know all the inner workings? And so maybe that's his opportunity to ask Jane. It's like, you know, whether you say he's taking interest in her, I think it's just because she has such a unique story, and then he can learn a little bit more about an orphan. Maybe he hasn't met a lot of orphans in his time.
True.
He can learn more about Lowood, because he probably doesn't know him. He might not know anybody that's gone through it, especially for 8 years like she did. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it's just like I said, it's a very different scene. It's still captivating, even though it's just a lot of question and answer. Mm-hmm. But it still keeps your attention, and it's quite a page turner. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we skipped a little bit ahead because I wanted to mention how at the very beginning of this chapter, you know, Jane has a little bit of melancholy feelings. Like she's going through her routine, but now that Mr. Rochester's in the house, I think it's clear that she's just feels even more left out now that he's there. And thankfully now he wants to talk to her and brings her into the circle.
That's what you think? She's feeling left out now? That he's...
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's more so than before Mr. Rochester arrived, because she did seem pretty melancholy beforehand, but I don't know. I guess maybe the way that Charlotte Bronte phrases it just seems like Jane's a little even more sadder now that there's a little bit more life going on, and Jane's kind of on the outer side of it, you know.
Oh, because she's just the governess, and doesn't get to be one of the invited guests.
She doesn't know who these people are coming through the house. You know, there's more noise, but she's still just in the room, locked away, kind of.
Yeah. It still makes me wonder what she was expecting then, taking this job.
I mean, probably not quite as much loneliness as she feels, because she doesn't have anybody of her own age or, you know, status to talk to.
Yeah, that's true. And I feel, you know, I think we talked about it before as well, that maybe there's still a little bit of that seasonal affective disorder. It's still dead of winter and you're stuck in this house, and then you're right. Now she wanted some clatter, sort of, and now you've got it, and it's not the right kind of clatter. Like you're right. There's no one. I can see there's no one her age. I say this as somebody who, my sister and I were the first children of our generation. And my parents, my dad was one of 6, my mom was one of 3. And so whenever there was like Thanksgiving or Christmas gatherings, we were not quite old enough to be at the grown-ups table, and then we were much older than the kids at the kids table. So it was a little bit awkward. So but it took a while, and once we got to be on a level with the parents, it was kind of awesome. And so I think maybe that's what this is. Maybe this is Jane not expecting to be at the level of parents, because Rochester is technically twice her age.
Well, yes, that's true.
And so maybe she does not expecting him to take so much interest in her. Yeah.
We'll substitute class status with age in this scenario, but I think that's a very apt comparison.
Yeah, and I feel like, and I think, you know, we'll probably get into it, but it seems like Rochester probably hasn't met too many people like Jane in his life, and Jane certainly hasn't met too many people like Rochester in her life. Yeah. And so that makes for just an awkward conversation, too, because they're getting to know each other, and yet they're not used to having their normal conversation topics, I think.
Well, yeah, but I also think it's a very dynamic conversation because, you know, they're learning more about each other, and the fact that Jane is not put off by the way Rochester acts around her, or the way he's a little abrupt and changeful, that she just seems to find it interesting. Then Mr. Rochester finds that interesting because she's not, you know, getting her back up and trying to, or making it seem like she didn't want to talk to him or anything. Yeah. And then of course her answers, you know, she takes what he says, and that sometimes he's a little bit sarcastic or humorous, and she just gives it back to him. I think that's, just a great way to see that they're going to be a good match.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about how it is a very dynamic conversation, and there's two elements that I kind of wanted to bring up, and that was, to me, it's from Rochester's point of view, it's a little bit, I don't know, it's kind of about power and control. Like, I thought, in a way, he makes her dress up for this, even though I guess, Miss Fairfax says, we always dress up when he's here.
Yeah, I thought well, maybe it's just more convention that you dress up while the master of the house is, or at least the owners, like if it was a family, you dress up for the family. Which
is still power and control, right? Like he's assumed that role, even whether he deserves it or not, because he's just the master of the house. And then the fact that he doesn't really even acknowledge her when they comes in, he can't be bothered. Yeah, maybe he's in pain, his ankle hurts, but
he's just not used to thinking that he has to acknowledge people because I guess there's a way that he can be a little arrogant,
sure, condescending is how I thought it was, and I don't know if that is just what happens when you have a lot of money and influence and very sparse social interaction. If you go weeks at a time without seeing other people than other than your employees, you know. But it's weird because it's he has that power and that control, but he's clearly taking an interest in her, and so he likes to tease her as well too. And then maybe that you could say teasing might come from a place of power and control as well. But then he's also very, very humorous in his way he goes about doing it. I love that. There's a line where he asked her how old she was when she went to Lowood, how long she was there, and then he says, arithmetic, you see, is useful. And I like that because for you and I always mentioned that I was always better at math than I was in English growing up, and you were the opposite. And now as adults, I find ways to bring up math, and you always have to make me do your math for you.
I like to use a calculator. Yes.
Yeah. It's something my father instilled in me because he was really big into math and whatnot. But yeah,
okay,
it does.
So you're just like Mr. Rochester.
I am older than you, yes. Oh. But it's, and like I said, it brings about, I wonder if he feels like he has to temper the conversation with some humor because he's worried he's going to lose her. If he's too gruff and too aloof, because it's a lot of questions. And I think that's something that we talk about, like even how you and I first met and we sort of started, when we were starting dating, there was always this notion that like asking questions, you want to ask a question so that you get an answer, so that shows that you really want to know what the answer is. If you're going on dates and the person's not asking a lot of questions, then you find yourself saying, like, are they really interested, or they're just here to bide their time? And I like to think that, when we first got together, we started by emailing each other. Then we had a long phone call. You texted me the second day, even though you were busy, and that's how I knew you were interested, because you had something to do. You were at a book festival with your mother, and yet you found time to keep texting me throughout that day. And I was trying to let you go and let you do your thing.
Yeah.
And then we had a first conversation on the phone later that night. Went on a little bit longer than I was expecting because you had somewhere else to be, and yet you stayed a little bit longer than you probably should have. And then our first date lasted 7 hours, because we found things to talk about. I don't know. And the funny thing is, now that I think about it, whenever people always ask me, how did I know that you were the one? I always bring up the fact that on our first date, you made fun of me.
A little teasing.
You made fun of how old my phone was.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself that if she's that comfortable enough to make fun of me, that she is quite the keeper. Now, this is different. I never felt that I was in control or had power and influence like Rochester probably has over Jane.
Or am I taking a page from Mr. Rochester's book here thinking, oh, that's how you get someone, is you tease them a little. Although I find that personally appealing, and I like the humor in their conversation in this first chapter, and then in subsequent chapters. I feel like there's a lot of humor in the way that Mr. Rochester and Jane talk to each other, and I think that's very important.
When you came on me in Hay Lane last night, I thought unaccountably of fairy tales. I had half a mind to demand whether you had bewitched my horse. Had you?
No, sir.
Promptly spoken. Do I believe you? Who are your parents?
I have none.
Nor ever had, I suppose. Do you remember them?
No, sir.
I thought not. So, you were waiting for your people when I saw you in the lane.
For whom, sir?
For the men in green. It was a proper moonlight evening for them. Did I break through one of your rings that you spread that damned ice on the causeway?
The men in green all forsook England 100 years ago. Not even in Hay Lane or the fields about it would you find a trace of them. I don't think summer, harvest, or winter moon will ever shine on their revels more.
So we're talking a lot about Jane and Rochester and their connection, and I think it's thought-provoking to think about the way Mr. Rochester is portrayed in this chapter, where he's a lot more moody and brooding, just like your really old-school romantic hero. Just, he's aloof and abrupt, and apparently that's appealing. I have to say that's appealing as a woman to... In a literary context, probably. I don't feel like I really look for that in life as I look at you here.
Well, this is a first impression, though, right? Like, it's
it is a first impression, and I think
surprising.
It's interesting to look at subsequent chapters and see how Jane cracks that shell a little bit and what Mr. Rochester becomes. But just from thinking about Jane's interest in Mr. Rochester right now, it does seem like, I don't know what these attributes they appeal to women in a way that, I don't know if it appeals to their nurturing side. They want to help him.
Why is that? Yeah.
I'm not sure, really. I don't know what it is.
Women think they can change a man. Is that what it is?
Yeah, and that's always a terrible way to think.
Awful. Yeah.
But Mr. Rochester does show a lot more attention to Jane, and this is probably more attention that she's received just focused on her than in this whole book. Like, when she was talking to Helen, I think Jane was asking her questions, and then Jane would remark on something, and then Helen would say, "Oh, what does that mean?" So it was more like, more of a give and take, whereas Mr. Rochester is just like, okay, where do you come from? What did you do there? What did you like to do on your off days and things like that? Mm-hmm. And he just seems to be really interested in her, which I think is also another reason why it might be attractive.
Well, yeah, and I think, you can get past some of his gruffness or his moody or brooding because if he keeps asking questions, and I think, like I said, there's a lot of questions in this. And there's one point that I actually wanted to bring up, and that was one line in particular that drew me out of this whole entire chapter. And it's a moment where Adele wants her presents, and she says, what about Jane's presents? Mm-hmm. And so Rochester's like, do you care about presents? What, and Jane says, they're generally thought to be pleasant things. Yeah. And then Rochester has the line where he says, generally thought, but what do you think?
Yeah.
And he's showing, like I said, he's showing specific interest in her. And also he's kind of embracing the idea that you don't necessarily have to think like everybody else does. Mm-hmm. That's one of my little pet peeves I see a lot with like a press conference. Especially, I mentioned I'm a big sports fan. I see this a lot in sports press conferences where reporters will say, they won't ask a question of the coach or the player. They'll just say, talk about this. Tell me about this.
Yeah.
Or what's worse is when they'll say, well, people are saying this. Mm-hmm. And every once in a while, I've always wondered if that coach or that player would say, I don't care what people are saying. What are you saying? You're the one. You're the reporter writing the story, asking me the question.
Do you believe these sources?
Yeah, it's always weird when people throw that out there because usually when they do that, it's generally meant as a way of saying, this is what I think, but I don't want to get all the heat for it. Mm-hmm. So I'll say, well, people are saying this. People said they don't like your cooking. People said they don't like that the way you drive, and it's like, but who are these people?
Who cares about these people?
Yeah, exactly. And so this is Rochester kind of fine tuning it and saying, well, whatever. Mm-hmm. Other people might think gifts are bad, but what do you think of them? Mm-hmm. And again, we've talked about it. Has Jane ever had a man like this in her life? Has anybody ever just focused their conversation specifically on her? Yeah. And maybe she's looking at into his broody features or his dark features, or if you say that with his sideburns and his
dark eyes.
Yeah, his dark eyes, and she just kind of gets lost in them, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so sweet.
And one of the weirdest parts about their playful conversation is when she brings up her art. Because I think you said something about that, he's charmed by it, but I don't know. I had a tougher time when I was reading the page. There was a lot of paragraphs in this chapter that I had to reread several times because of Charlotte's just very wordy.
Oh yeah,
and using a lot of phrases that I was not overly familiar with. But the way I read it is that he's just he comes off as he's too much of a critic. You know, and it's almost a little too critical, where it's just like, this is an 18-year-old girl, orphan, who's been in this institution and barely survived all these life-threatening diseases, and just happened to draw in her spare time, and yet he's kind of going at her like she's some professional, and it was...
well, I guess I felt like he was just more asking her questions because her paintings were so unconventional, and it showed like a unique mind underneath all there, and that makes Mr. Rochester even more interested. And you know, I put together a little breakdown about these paintings because I think that they're interesting. You know, they're really glossed over in a lot of adaptations, but they show a lot of symbolism and show her mindset, especially maybe foreshadowing a little bit of what's going to happen. So I thought it might be fun to do a quick deep dive into these 3 paintings that Mr. Rochester looks at.
Do we have, is there a police sketch artist that has drawn the 3 paintings that we can know what they look like?
Well, I mean, I hate to keep mentioning my favorite adaptation, 1973 miniseries, and I think they do a pretty good job of recreating exactly what's described.
Really?
So maybe I'll try to pull a picture of those to post on the Instagram. Okay. So the first one that he looks at is a shipwreck, and it shows a bird, cormorant, holding a gold bracelet in its beak and a drowned woman's arm and wrist above the waves. So that's not great for a little girl to paint.
A drowning woman? Yeah, these paintings are very dark.
Yeah, very dark.
And I don't know if this is just kind of a allusion to the fact that she's experienced a lot of death and sorrow in her life, and maybe that's just what stuck with her.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is more normal for children in that time period where they were so exposed to death and disease and horrible happenings. But
we get a bird reference.
Yeah, bird reference, and just the idea that this woman drowned and the bird, again, thinking that bird is free. You know, Jane is trapped in her, you know, social standings and as a woman in what she wants to do in life. This bird takes her possessions and is able to fly free. And then we have the second painting, which is a little simpler. It's a woman blending into a twilight sky with her head crowned with stars. And Mr. Rochester mentions that he sees Mount Latmos across in the distance. And that brings the reference to the goddess Selene, who fell in love with Endymion and vowed to protect him forever. So that might be foreshadowing a little bit of Jane's potential emotional commitment, that Mr. Rochester is wondering if she's going to be someone who will protect the man she loves, perhaps. I mean, it is Mr. Rochester who makes that connection between Selene and Mount Latmos.
And this is another example, I think, we go back to that power and control, where he's older than her, and sometimes I feel like he's going to show off some of his knowledge. And making references to something that maybe she assumes that she doesn't know. You know, I think there's a line that he quotes from Othello in this chapter as well. Mm-hmm. So he's quoting Shakespeare at her, and he's bringing up Mount Latmos and some Greek legends. So that's another one of those know-it-all moments, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I think Jane understands his references, so that's also another time to point out that they are well matched. Mm-hmm. So then the third painting is a little bit weirder. It's a colossal head resting against an iceberg with 2 hands supporting the head, and then there's a dark veil against it. It seems to reference Paradise Lost by John Milton, because Jane says, in quotations, the likeness of a kingly crown that's on the head, and then the shape which shape had none, which are quotes from the Paradise Lost book. So, I mean, I haven't actually read Paradise Lost.
No, I never have either.
So I'm not totally familiar with it or what that actually means. I just kind of looking on Google. It seems that that comes the quote comes from descriptions of Satan and hell. Again, pretty dark for schoolgirls' paintings. and it's just full of despair, which that's something that she's experienced in her life, and maybe perhaps might experience further in this book.
Yeah, and once again, makes her that much more intriguing to Rochester. Mm-hmm. What kind of girl is drawing this stuff?
Definitely.
Did you sit long each day painting these?
Yes. It was the vacation, and I sat at them from morning till noon, and from noon till night. Oh, the length of the midsummer days favoured my inclination to apply.
And were you happy?
I was absorbed, sir. Yes, I was happy. To paint them was to enjoy one of the keenest pleasures I've ever known.
That's not saying much. Your pleasures, by your own account, have been few. I dare say you did exist in a kind of artist dreamland. Did you feel self-satisfied with these results of your long labours?
Far from it. I was tormented between my idea and my handiwork. In each case, I'd imagined something I was quite powerless to realise.
Not quite. You've secured the shadow of your thought. You've not enough skill to give it full being. Yet these are, for a schoolgirl, peculiar. As to the thoughts, they are elfish. And who taught you to paint wind? There's a high gale in that sky. And that hilltop is Latmos. Where did you see Latmos?
In our previous episode, we had a little segment where we had an open casting call, and wonder of wonders, Mr. Matthew McConaughey showed up.
I'm
crazy.
so impressed. Yeah,
I know.
And where did he find the time?
I can't tell you, but he showed up, read some lines as Mr. Rochester. He's waiting to hear back.
Yeah.
We have someone else coming in today. It's a little bit of a odd choice, but I think that people like him, and he'll bring a very different vibe to Mr. Rochester.
Are you sure I'm not too old for the plot?
Don't worry, Mr. Walken. We were thinking of doing like an audio version, audio adaptation as well. So I think that would work. So yeah, Mr. Christopher Walken is here to read as Mr. Rochester.
My pleasure, Charlene. A big fan of the Bronte sisters.
Glad to hear it.
So do I just jump right in?
Yeah, you have this line right here. I think that it'll be a fun one to read.
Oh, don't fall back on over-modesty. I've examined Adele and find you have taken great pains with her. She's not bright. She has no talent. Yet in a short time, she's made much improvement.
Ah, wonderful. I think that would be perfect for
great.
audio.
That was excellent. I got to say. And maybe he is a little on the old side.
Yeah.
But like you said, there's digital technology. They could de-age him.
Oh, maybe an animated Jane Eyre? I think you would do really well, Mr. Walken, for that.
Go.
Your voice is so distinct, and we all want a distinct voice, Mr. Rochester.
Have your people call my people.
Yeah, we'll get back to you. Thank you so much. Well, just in case you didn't listen to the previous episode, but I think it's funny when Mike does his impressions. So here he comes in with his second impression, speaking in Mr. Rochester's lines.
Again, I don't think I'm that good, but Charlene seems to like it. So, but it's fun. It's fun to just imagine in a way. And I almost did that.
Yeah, your voice.
Sorry, I was doing my impression of Christopher Walken.
Yeah, it's hard not to speak like him when he's around, right?
Certain mannerisms that you have to do. But yeah, who knows? Maybe he might have been considered for the part.
Yeah.
In the.
I mean, truthfully, I'm not sure about that choice, but sure.
Yeah, but I don't know. He has his moments of the brooding.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I could see him being aloof for sure. All right. Let's wrap up this episode, as we always do, with a meaningful passage or quote. And so I'm going to let Charlene kick it off. Charlene, from chapter 13, what was one of the most meaningful passages for you?
So I mentioned that I love the humor and the teasing in Jane and Rochester's conversation. So this quote kind of leaps out at me as a great, kind of funny exchange. So begins. Where did you get your copies? Out of my head. That head I see now on your shoulders? Yes, sir. Has it other furniture of the same kind within? I should think it may have. I should hope better. So, I mean, it's not much. You know, I kind of had a hard time picking a quote from this chapter just because a lot of it is just dialogue, like you said, and maybe the more introspective passages can appeal to me and it's easier to talk about. But again, I just love that Jane and Rochester already seem to feel very comfortable with each other.
Certain level of comfort for sure. Yeah.
And there's so much quick wit on both sides.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I had that in my notes as well. That's a great line. That head I see now on your shoulders has it other furniture of the same kind within. That head I see now on your shoulders. Yeah, that's a very good line. Yeah.
Okay, so now what's your quote?
Mine actually comes from the very end of the chapter, and this is we've had the whole scene with the two of them together. And then finally she retires. Jane retires for the evening. She goes back with Mrs. Fairfax and she starts to get some of his backstory. Mm-hmm. And as she's pressing Miss Fairfax, she already did when she first showed up at the house, right? She asked a bunch of questions of Mrs. Fairfax and Mrs. Fairfax was like, yeah, sure. Yeah, he's not here, whatever. She's kind of getting over it. But then when when Jane talks about how abrupt he is, you know, Mrs. Fairfax says, oh, you know, you got to forgive him for that. And she says, why? And then the line that Mrs. Fairfax says is, quote, partly because it is his nature, and we can none of us help our nature, and partly because he has painful thoughts, no doubt, to harass him and make his spirits unequal. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, when I pulled this quote, I did not know that you were going to title the episode after this, but it was...
It's a great quote.
It is a good quote. And I feel like, you know, we've just been introduced to Rochester, and we're just learning the slightest bit about who he is, just enough to keep the reader intrigued. Yeah. You know, like Mrs. Fairfax talks about his father and brother, but it still seems like there's still some more. Yeah. You know, you don't want to give it to everybody. You don't want to throw it all out there once. You know, he's going to be a very important character moving forward. And I feel like Charlotte Bronte is very slowly peeling back the onion here. And it's right there at the end of the chapter. And then before you know it, Mrs. Fairfax is like, I'm ready, I'm done. That's enough for the night and go to bed.
Yeah. It does create more interest for Miss Rochester and for Jane to peel back those layers, like you said. And it's a great ending to this chapter.
Yeah, and before we go, there's one more little Easter egg I wanted to drop in, and that's just sort of an inside joke between Charlene and I. There is a moment where Rochester's asking Jane if he plays the piano, and she's like, I play a little, and he's like, go play. Mm-hmm. You know, I got to hear it. And then he apologizes to her and says, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound like that. You know, it's kind of a customary habit of mine or whatever. But then he says, go then into the library, take a candle with you, leave the door open.
Yeah, that's a great song now, Mr. Rochester. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, that wraps up this episode. And now that it's January 2022, I wish everyone a happy new year again and hope that this is going to be a great, safe, and healthy year for everyone listening.
And happy 175th anniversary of the publishing of Jane Eyre.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.